Hello, and welcome to the Trauma Informed Parent Podcast. I'm Susie DeYoung here with my partner, Catherine Galda, and we are so excited today to have with you Dr. Peter Levine. Dr. Levine is the developer of Somatic Experiencing, a naturalistic and neurobiological approach to healing trauma. He holds doctorates in both biophysics and psychology and is the founder and president of the Ergos Institute of Somatic Education and the founder and advisor for Somatic Experiencing International. Dr. Levine recently finished his autobiography, An Autobiography of Trauma, A Healing Journey, and is the author of several best-selling books on trauma, including Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma, personal favorite, Trauma Through a Child's Eyes, which I found very helpful in my parenting of a child who had experienced a trauma. Dr. Levine continues to teach trauma healing workshops internationally, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here.
Good. Good to be with you.
Thank
Glad
you.
you're glad you're carrying the mantle. I like the idea of trauma-informed parenting because I think it's it's really accurate. I mean, as parents, in order to really be there for our kids to support their development and their healing, we need to know something about how kids are affected by trauma. Now, I'm not talking just about, the horrible trauma and abuse that unfortunately many children are exposed to, which was studied by Vincent Felitti in the ACE questionnaire. And actually he and I were doing an interview together. And so we were between, I think Dan Siegel was on and the two of us were in the green room. And, I asked him, I said, I'm just wondering, how come you didn't include in the questionnaire things like children who were exposed to accidents and to invasive medical procedures and so forth? And he really pondered that and he said, yeah, you're right. If I wrote it again, I would include those. I don't know. It might have been a problem to do it because he was at a major hospital chain.
Right.
So to talk about medical trauma might have been a little bit difficult.
But like
again,
I told you in the break, like that was the trauma my son experienced, was a medical trauma. And a lot of parents, like me included, think, well, we had great doctors, so let's get him home and get back to normal. And it was around adolescence where he started showing the signs of much more than just the physical injuries. So we really do need to know that stuff.
Yeah, and often, as you were describing, these things remain dormant and they don't show up until later in the child's development. Maybe when there's some kind of a precipitating event, or even in the absence of one. Sometimes it just has that delayed effect with changes in, in their growth cycles and so forth. So again, the book that, you just showed, Trauma Through a Child's Eyes, that was originally developed primarily for therapists, but also for parents who wanted to go deeply into the topic. And then we also did one specifically for parents and teachers called Trauma Proofing Your Kids.
Yes.
And again, that was a much smaller book, which gave very succinct, precise things that can happen to the many more they're significant traumas, but they're not usually seen as significant.
Yes.
Again, the child that, goes through the plate glass window and winds up in the emergency room. Believe me, that is a trauma.
Yes.
And I've worked with adults where that's happened to them several decades before. And then something happened, in their life. And I think in one or two cases, they just had an argument with a spouse and boom, all of this came back up.
Yes.
So it makes so much sense to be proactive.
Yep.
And I think if anything, that would be my message to parents, that these things are rarely benign.
Yes.
Well,
any parent of a young child who has access to that book should get it, because I read it after my kids had grown. I was like, wow, this would have been really valuable when they were little.
Well, and same for me. You know, my daughter's trauma, like your son's, happened when they were 7. My daughter's a survivor of the Sandy Hook school shootings, and
Yeah,
the manifestation of symptoms, right? And I'm a clinician, so we did a lot in the beginning, but she really showed a lot more symptoms in adolescence. And so you talked,
yeah,
Dr. Levine, about, that nothing traumatic. There was not a secondary traumatic trigger, but just simple biological development, right? Entering into
that's right.
adolescence and the questioning of
Yeah,
who am I and why am
yep,
I brought about for her a lot of struggle. And had
yeah,
I read this
that's
book
right.
then, might have done
Right,
I might have
right.
made a few different choices.
Well,
I
the good news is it's never too late.
Right? Isn't that, thank goodness for that. So I guess, as a first kind of question, can you speak a little bit more to the idea of parents needing to regulate themselves or care for themselves in this
Yes,
process? Because that's so important and
yes,
a message that
absolutely.
doesn't really get transmitted. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a really big one. I'm glad you brought that up, Kat. You know, the first reaction, usually, if the child is injured, the parent rushes in and they're frightened. And sometimes the fear comes out as anger. And so that's what the child is exposed to.
Hmm.
So they think that they've done something really wrong. And so that even, makes the trauma go in even deeper,
Hmm.
and so it's absolutely essential. If a child's been injured, of course, you've got to go up to the child, depending on their age, to gently, cradle them, hold them, but to take care of your own fear, your own activation first, so that doesn't get projected onto the child, which it will. And that's how children learn emotional reactions, is by observing their parents. There's a classic experiment that was done a number of years ago. Do you know the one where you have a glass surface, and then below the glass there's a hole.
Yes, I
You
do know
know,
that. Yes.
yeah. And if the parent is on the other side and they're not showing fear, the child will usually just crawl over and go into the arms of the parent, of the adult. But if the adults are showing, and they're told to do this, to show the fear themselves, then the child will start out and they'll hesitate and they won't go across, because then they become frightened of the drop off based on the way the parents project their own apprehension, their own anxiety, their own fear. So to really use the skills in somatic experiencing to first connect with your own fear, which means the sensations of the fear.
Hmm.
Find out where it is in your body. Is it twisting of a gut? Is it a chest contraction? Is it rapid heartbeat? Is it hyperventilation, or not breathing at all?
Dizziness.
And
For me, it was
dizziness,
dizziness. Hmm.
dizziness. Yeah, yeah, yeah. All of those are kinds of things. And we need to take those moments to do that. Of course, we need to respond to our children and to our babies, our infants. But if we don't do that for ourselves first, we are very often projecting fear onto them.
Yep.
Exactly,
Really good
exactly.
point.
And that goes so far, just in the example you explained. It tells our children, gives our children information about how to react, and
Yes.
whether or not they're going to be okay. And I think that that's in the work that I do, I cannot emphasize that enough when I'm working with adults who have children who've experienced traumatic events or even who are struggling,
Yeah.
Hmm.
that what we do first matters so
Right.
much.
And that it's
Yeah. Yeah.
okay to feel a little fear. It's okay to feel a little anxiety. We don't have to run from it. It's
Right.
like,
It's
let's just
natural.
watch
It's
it.
normal. It's natural.
Yeah.
But we don't have to be swept away from it. And again, in somatic experiencing and in those books, we teach very simple skills that parents can do and practice. Because not if, but when something's going to happen.
Hmm.
The child are going to have the fall off the bicycle, or they're going to break in a
Yes.
window or something like this.
Which
So
leads me to another question, actually. What are like the fall off the bicycle or things that normally you wouldn't equate with trauma? What are some of the less obvious signs of trauma in children that parents and educators may miss?
yeah, well, again, so many of these are age dependent. A typical one, if there is even a typical one, is clinginess or reverting to an earlier stage of development. So a lot of time, these kids who were bedwetters when they were much younger start bedwetting again.
Mhm.
And sometimes the parents, are upset about that, but for the wrong reason.
Mhm.
Because, that's really saying that they need extra support. And again, we give exercises to have the children draw different pictures and draw pictures of where the sensations are in their body. So again, these are things that parents can do to help kids in the aftermath. You mentioned that your daughter was in Sandy Hook,
Mhm.
and and so that is something that is beyond horrible. But it's becoming more and more abnormally normal.
Right.
Just right here, actually, I'm going to Vienna to give a presentation, and they just had a mass shooting.
Yes, saw
You
that.
know,
Saw
yeah,
that too.
and that was in Gans, in Austria.
And one of
So,
the kids who was at Newtown is actually over there in that town studying right now. She's grown up now,
oh
but she's
wow,
a friend of mine's
wow,
daughter who is I
wow,
forget the name of the town, begins with a G, but she's over there.
Gans. I think it's
Yes.
Gans. Yeah.
Hmm.
That's
So
it,
it's
really. In that's really interesting. It's ironic in a way.
yeah. Are there
Yeah.
any specific like cultural or societal myths about childhood trauma that you think are very harmful or outdated
Well,
now?
okay. One simple one is that kids are resilient, and it's true. Kids are resilient, and they'll get over it on their own. That's not true. And even though they're resilient, they still can be affected, sometimes deeply affected. So we want to engage their resilience in helping them, resolve the trauma, but we
Hmm.
don't want to count on that because they're resilient, there's nothing that we need to attend to. So
Definitely.
they're clinging, so they're waking up in the middle of the night screaming with nightmares. Time will take care of this. Time will heal everything. Not true.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Not true. And sometimes it actually becomes more deeply embedded in the child rather than lessening over time.
Yes. And I think
Well,
what's great about, sorry, Catherine,
no, that's okay.
just 'cause what you're doing, and this is one of the things I wish was around in 2004, is a lot of people also, what I think is an outdated way of thinking, is that if you have a trauma, you need to talk about it. You need to get to therapy and talk to somebody. And I didn't know about things like somatic therapy, music, theatric therapy, music therapy, art therapy. I didn't know about this in
Yeah.
2004. And that's such a good vehicle. Those are all such good vehicles, especially for little kids.
Yeah, I've worked with a number of kids or adults who, were traumatized as kids. And some of what was the most difficult for them is when they were asked to talk to the school counselor or a psychologist about what happened to them.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And afterward, they became even more, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? More shut down,
Hmm.
more shut down, because this goes beyond words. So you
Yeah.
mentioned art and movement; those are really important. You know, uh, I often in the books we describe having the kids draw stories about what happened, but not just that, or not even mostly that, but how they see that they will be after some time when the ouchie goes away.
Hmm. Hmm. Wow.
So they get a picture that there was a beginning, then this event happened, and then there was a sequelae, But then it's going to, again, given the support that's necessary, that is absolutely necessary, they will go back and maybe even be more confident and more resilient.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think actually, I think the subtitle of, I think it was the Trauma Proofing Your Kids, A Parent's Guide for Instilling Confidence, Joy, and Resilience.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when the kids really become resilient, when they work through the trauma, when they're guided through the trauma, and not when they're asked just to talk about it.
Yes, definitely.
Well, and I think inherent in that, when you talk about engaging resilience, Dr. Levine, or you talk about guiding through the trauma, right? There's kind of a team approach, right? You're there
Mm,
with them. There's an acknowledgement that this terrible thing happened, that there's impact from that terrible thing or things, and that with work and time and support and connection, that they can move through it. So you're kind of instilling hope
right.
before just as you begin and every step along the
Mm,
journey. So I kind of
yes.
wonder, like, and I know it's incredibly difficult to titrate to one thing, but what is there something that our listeners can kind of take away as a single tool to kind of start their journey of co-regulation with their kids? Like, what
Well,
would be something
sure.
that's easy that they can learn from you
Yeah, yeah.
in a podcast?
But again, first of all, to do some simple awareness, self-awareness when a disturbing event happens to a child. Yeah, that's the first thing, of course. And, a lot of times the children will engage through play so that their body can do what it needed to do, what it wanted to do, but what it couldn't do at the time of the trauma. Did they want to fight back? Did they want to run? Did they want to tell their parent,
Mm-hmm.
or a teacher that they were being bullied or, something like that? So, and a lot of times, no, I worked with kids, of course, it's pretty common, really, unfortunately, that kids get bullied,
Yeah. Yeah.
and um, so, I work with them to engage what I call healthy aggression.
Okay.
So the impulse to fight back. So it's not really about banging and hitting pillows or something like that, but of really directing their strength and energy. So sometimes I'll hold a pillow or even my hand and then just have them push against my hand and breathe and feel the power that's being enlisted in their body and what that body had wanted to do, but it was at the time overwhelmed or kept a secret.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah, I saw that in one of your videos with a veteran where you had him kind of taking his fist and pushing it into a pillow that you were holding as a means
Right.
of activating all of the muscles in his body and helping
Yeah.
him to release some of that. So that's thank you, because I
Yeah.
think that
Yeah.
I know for me, I wish I had known that
Yeah.
years ago. But the idea of being able to regulate myself a little bit, to breathe, to kind of check in with myself during the process of trying to help my child,
Yeah.
helps me to be able to notice what they need a little bit more and to ask the right questions, right? Because we're wanting to
Yeah.
kind of see where they are. We're not necessarily telling them to, like Susie was saying, talk about your experience. It's just, it seems like it's more, where are you right now? Am I hitting that right?
Sure.
If I'm wrong,
Yeah.
correct me.
Yeah. 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 I mean, again, we want to look at action
Hmm.
and action that was thwarted, that was prevented from executing. The example that you giving about the Marine who served in Iran,
Hmm.
Afghanistan, and Iraq, and it's called Ray. He's called Ray, and there's a short documentary called Ray's Story, Somatic Experiencing with Peter Levine, something like that. And I
Mm.
think it's available on YouTube. And one of the things you'll see when you were talking about him directing his aggression into the pillow, first of all, some of the other members of the group are kind of by his side and then kind of like holding back so he doesn't just explode with the anger. So to help him direct it. And then there was others people, helping me hold, I think it's a cushion or something like that.
Yeah.
So he can direct that in and connect with his feelings. So even though this was an adult, obviously a Marine, it still can give you some ideas about what you can do with kids.
Yeah. And anger is, I mean, that was one of the things that emerged in my son when he was 15. And a lot of the response we got is, oh, teenage anger, that's typical. But again,
Mhm.
if you are trauma informed or know a little about it and your child has had something, some of it is normal with teenagers. I have two other
Sure.
kids too, but this was a different level. And
Yeah.
it's helpful to know that. But I do have a
Yeah.
question, like there's a lot of mental health concerns around the world today with young people, and obviously they all haven't had trauma. That's very different than trauma. What do you think is the most significant impacting variable in regard to what's going on today? Because
Yeah.
I do research for an author, and I interview all these experts, and I feel
Sure.
like, with that quote, every time you see, what is it? If you only have a hammer, everything's a nail. Like,
Right. It's
the
like a
social
nail.
media experts think it's social
Yeah.
media, and the
Right, right,
climate
right, right,
change
right.
experts think it's, what do you
Yeah.
think?
Well, I was actually coming back from teaching in Vecchius in the Lake of Lucerne when the airplanes hit the buildings on 9/11.
Mm.
And one of the things that I noticed was that well, that's what they do. I don't want to be, you know, uh, scolding them, but they show the same thing over and over and over again.
Yep.
And so the children were thinking that those were separate events that were happening. And it really, really terrified them. So when I returned, strangely enough, I was asked, I think it was by Fox News, to do an interview. And, she asked me, well, what, what would you recommend for parents? And I said, well, first of all, don't watch the television while the children are awake if they're showing these things.
Yeah.
Because again, kids can't separate it out.
Right.
That, this isn't something that's just happening once, but they're showing it again.
Yeah.
So, I said that, and she was, well, I think she was respectful. She didn't say, well, how do you think we can sell commercials? And I wasn't again scolding them for that, but just giving that information of how children process these kind of events, and that we really have to protect them. And that's the job of a parent, to protect them.
So you think they're being exposed? I mean, there's like 9/11, type news that coming at us every day these days.
Yeah,
Not
of
that
course.
severe,
Faster,
but
yeah.
is that, they're being exposed over and over again to
That's right.
nonstop information.
Yeah, I mean, this one here, this horrible thing that just recently happened with the airplane crash in India.
Yep.
Yeah.
I didn't go on to watch, but I needed to get some basic information for a project that I was working on. And there it was, that was the example of showing it over and over and over. And again, when children see that, they think the planes are going to crash, and then the parents don't notice anything. But then when the family is planning to take a trip by plane, the children start having nightmares.
Yeah. It's
Mhm.
interesting you should say that, because I'm remembering, like, as a kid, like when there would be a plane crash and it would be on the cover of like the Daily News. I lived in New York City, and I remember feeling I would see that because my parents got the paper, but that was my only exposure was that paper.
Right.
And I remember feeling scared, but then that was it. I cannot imagine being that age and seeing it
Yeah.
constantly.
Yeah, really, really. And, it's just bombarded. So the kids have to be protected. And like you say, it's not just social media. I mean, there are problems for sure, especially with adolescents,
Yeah.
especially with adolescent girls. But the way they're just exposed, the exposure that's endless of danger, of threat, and and then also how to deal with their emotions. My co-author Maggie for the two books,
Yep.
Maggie Klein, she wrote a wonderful book, just came out. It's called My Inner Doggy is Growling.
What a
Great
great
name.
title.
Great title.
Yeah, yeah. And again, it's a way of kind of helping kids learn to feel their feelings in a non-judgmental way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You
Yeah,
write on the website, there's a quote, trauma therapy for the future can be more important than trauma therapy for the past.
yeah,
What does
right.
the
That's
future
good.
look like?
That's it. I didn't know I wrote that, but it
Or
sounds
something that's
familiar.
on your website.
Yeah, that's okay. Um, yeah, I think, trauma can either bring people together
Hmm.
or can tear people apart.
Yeah.
Again, if you just look at some of the news that's going on, you see these endless conflagrations, the endless wars, and they just continue as though it's the same war, and from obviously from my perspective, which is a little different than most people, I see how detrimental that is, and that these children who are the ones that are, um, how to say, um, that are exposed to this violence.
Mhm.
And these are kids 4, 5, 6 years old.
Yeah.
Well, by the time they're in adolescence, in mid-adolescence, they are going to be reacting with violence, and
Mhm.
again, this cycle just continues, whether it be a cycle of damage or, if we know to reverse it, a cycle of grace.
Well, that's
Yeah.
why you're doing the work you're doing, and thank you for that.
Mhm.
Um,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have our
Yeah.
fun, unless Catherine, you have another question. We end every podcast with the same question, but I want to make sure Catherine doesn't have another one.
No, I think we've covered everything. This has been such a wonderful experience. So go ahead, Susie.
Okay, so if you, Dr. Levine, could go back in time and teach or tell your parents or educators one thing about trauma, what would that be?
Well, first of all, I would say to everyone that trauma is a fact of life. And that's per our discussion, but it doesn't have to be a life sentence. I'm just thinking about, you mentioned the autobiography of trauma, a healing journey book that I just completed a couple of months ago.
Mhm.
And, I was exposed to severe violence, life threat violence through a whole period of my life. And in order to make sure that my parents were silent, because there was a mafia that put a contract out on my family.
Wow. And you were a
And so,
child
and I
during
was a
this?
child,
Oh, wow.
and I was violently raped to give my parents the message that if they testified in Johnny DeAguardo's words, he would find his family face down in the East River. But to work with that trauma, well, I was having some very disturbing symptoms and flashes of images.
Mhm.
And so I asked one of my students to sit with me to guide me. And I very much believe in Chiron, and Chiron is the wounded healer. And for all of us who work in the healing arts, the healing professions, the therapeutic professions, I think it's essential that we do our own healing work.
Absolutely.
So my guide, my student, knew not to take me right into the middle of the trauma, which again is a typical type of therapy that's been done. It's called prolonged exposure.
Yeah.
And so instead, we went to a memory, a bodily memory, but with images, to when I was 4 years old. It was my birthday, and my parents must have come into my room in the middle of the night or early in the morning, and underneath my bed, and then out into the room, and then back underneath the bed, they laid the tracks for a railroad train set. And so when I awoke, the train was going around, and I
Wonderful.
literally jumped out of bed and ran over to the transformer to change the speed and then make the horn go toot toot. And though I didn't have the words for it then, even though so many violent and neglectful things happened, I knew in that moment, not cognitively, but in my body, that I was cared about and that I was loved. And again, I would say that these are the kind of experiences that we want to cultivate and bring into our bodily experience.
Yes, that's very well said, because it's funny, you don't have the language at that age, but
No.
you can remember the feeling. That's why I love that quote. You may not remember what people say, but you'll remember how they made you feel. It sums up everything.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to share before we sign off?
No.
Okay. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, I enjoyed connecting with you folks, and I really encourage you to go on with your work.
Thank you so much.
As things are in this world, it is more and more needed, more and more needed.
Absolutely, we will.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for being a part of it, and wishing you well.
Okay,
Very
great.
much so.
And
Take
please
care.
get Dr. Levine's books, any of them, all the ones he just mentioned, which we'll put links in the
Oh,
conversation
good.
of where
Oh,
to
and
get
they
them.
can go to the website, somaticexperiencing.com.
Yes, we will put
And
that up.
there's a list of all of those written materials and video materials.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, all
Take
right.
care.
So take care, Susie.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao.